Michael?
As most of you know, February is Black History Month. This year, BDTV and the Martin Luther King Association of Westfield have joined forces to honor Black history in a way that is relevant to us in Westfield.
Senior Kayla Louison takes from here.
Hi, I'm Kayla Louison, and throughout the month of February, I'm going to be taking you on the brand new Westfield African American History Walking Tour. Throughout the tour, I will be interviewing some members of the Dr. Martin Luther King Association at some of the sites. Today, I'm joined with longtime MLK Association leader Donnell Carr, who is going to tell us about some of the important Black Americans of the 20th century who were key players in the Harlem Renaissance and lived right here in Westfield for a time.
The Harlem Renaissance was a period, but it was mainly a movement that took place in Harlem, started in the early 20s, maybe pre-20s, and went a little beyond the 30s. It was a period of where art and literature and music were just heightened, and you had all kinds of stars. And one of the stars that we want to talk about today is Paul Robeson, because we're standing here at the Paul Robeson Memorial site. It's really the Robeson family site. Paul Robeson was quite a character. He spent 3 years in Westfield. He went to Westfield High for a year where he played football. Paul Robeson was a singer, he was an actor, he was a humanitarian, he was a writer. He was all of the above, and in fact, he was a very transcendent person, because when he was in Harlem with all the other contributors to the Renaissance, they all had specific areas. Some were artists, some were sculptors, and so forth, but he covered about everything that could be covered. This monument in this park was dedicated to the Robeson family in 2007 by the town of Westfield. It turned out that this particular site here, we discovered that there was a house here, and the Robeson family actually lived here for a while when they moved from Princeton to Westfield.
Okay, so we are now at the St. Luke's AME Zion Church on 500 Downer Street. Could you tell us a little bit about the origin of this church and how the Robesons got involved?
The church actually was started at this location by the Quakers. In 1907, Paul Robeson's family, which consisted of his father and himself, came to Westfield to minister. His father, William Drew, came here to minister at this church and pretty much established the church as it is known today. Now, the church in the Black community is a very important institution. It's not just a place for worship, it's more or less a social center. Everything in the Black community pretty much goes through the church, at least during that period. It's changing a bit now, but the church has always been that important institution in the community. In Westfield, there are two African American churches. One is Bethel Baptist, and of course, St. Luke's, and both of them have been very important to the Black community in Westfield.
We now continue our celebration of Black History Month. Kayla Louison tells us about two significant Westfield homes.
So we are now at the residence of Ms. Zora Neale Hurston, and some of our students may have read their book, Their Eyes Were Watching God. So can you give us a little bit more about how long she lives here and the significance of this location?
Okay, the significance of the location is that she lived here. And she lived here for about a year while she was collaborating with Langston Hughes, who lived at the time over on Downer Street. And they were writing a play. The play was titled Mule Bone, based on one of her books, The Bone of Contention. And it's a play that never got to Broadway until 1991.
What is the significance of 514 that's behind us?
Well, 514 Downer Street is where Langston Hughes, the prodigious poet, used to live. He lived here in 1930 before he moved to Harlem, to Manhattan. But he lived here again while working on a play with Zora Neale Hurston. We wondered why they were here at the same time, and it turns out they had the same benefactor, so maybe that's why they were here.
And we know that he's a very influential poet and writer. Can you tell us a little bit about his most famous works?
Famous? That's a good one. He had a lot. But there's one particularly I like that can I read it?
Yes.
Because I have
Please
it here.
do.
I would like to quote it, but I think I'll mess it up quoting it. So it's called Harlem. And again, I'm connecting things to the Harlem Renaissance, right, when we talk about this person. What happens to a dream deferred? Does it dry up like a raisin in the sun, or fester like a sore and then run? Does it stink like rotten meat, or crust and sugar over like a syrupy sweet? Maybe it just sags like a heavy load, or does it explode? That's one of my favorite poems by him. The whole thrust of the Harlem Renaissance was the achievement of racial equality for folks. It was always about this movement we call the Civil Rights Movement. And Langston wanted to be part of it, and of course many others, but they all had the same thing in mind. They wanted to achieve equality and justice for all people. He wrote beautiful poetry. He wrote meaningful poetry. And I think we have another poem that we want to read, right?
Yes.
So would you like to read that one?
I would like to.
Okay.
This is I Too by Langston Hughes. I too sing America. I am the darker brother. They send me to eat in the kitchen when company comes. But I laugh and eat well and grow strong. Tomorrow, I'll be at the table when company comes. Nobody'll dare say to me, eat in the kitchen then. Besides, they'll see how beautiful I am and be ashamed. I too am America.
We continue our celebration of Black History Month on the Westfield African American Walking Tour. Kayla Louison is downtown with more.
Hi, I'm Kayla Louison, and today we continue to celebrate Black History Month as we visit spots on the Westfield African American History Walking Tour. Today, we confront one of America's most difficult times in our history, that of slavery. I'm here in downtown Westfield where we eat, shop, walk, all the time. But just over 200 years ago, this was also a spot where people, human beings, were bought and sold. I'm with Elisa Seneman of the Westfield MLK Association, who will tell us more about what was once the site of slave auctions in Westfield. So many people think that northern states like New Jersey didn't participate in the slave trade. However, where we're standing right now contradicts that. Can you tell us a little bit about this site?
Sure. We're here at the PNC Plaza, and this is the approximate vicinity where there was a slave auction block. Now, many people can't believe that slavery existed in Westfield, but historians tell us that in the 1800s, there was active trading of enslaved people right in the streets here. And in 1757, the Westfield resident Cornelius Hetfield put an ad in the paper for a slave auction of a likely, quote, a likely parcel of boys and girls aged 12 to 20. And implicit in this ad is the cruel separation of children from their parents. There is an oral tradition that there was a whipping post here in Westfield on Martine and West Broad. And that too tells us something, that fining enslaved people was not a practical means of punishment, because enslaved people didn't have property. And to incarcerate them would deprive their owners of their labor. So whipping had an economic basis to it. This speaks to more of the intolerable conditions that people face. 300 years later, we stand here, we acknowledge the history, and pass the baton to younger people in town, students, to tell and honor the story.
We continue our celebration of Black History Month on the Westfield African American Walking Tour in Fairview Cemetery. We now go to Kayla Louison.
Fairview Cemetery is by far the largest burial ground, and many are laid to rest here. But today, we're going to focus specifically on some graves that connect with slavery and the Civil War. The tombstone here says Jude, a faithful and beloved servant. Can you tell us more about who this was?
Certainly. So the Denman family, who are buried here, they were a very close family. They obviously loved their servant Jude. You will see on her tombstone it says beloved servant. There is a beautiful photograph, and you can see she's well dressed, she looks very healthy, she looks happy. They seem to have had a very positive relationship with her. In addition, we recently uncovered Mr. Denman's will, and in his will he instructs his wife to care for Jude. He predeceases Jude and his wife, and so there are instructions to care for her. So what we see is beloved servant. But when we look closely at the tombstone, we see that Jude died at the age of 42, and that it says she's a beloved servant for 39 years. That means she was a servant at 3 years old. So that tells a story.
Now we visit the grave sites of African Americans who fought during the Civil War. And as we can see, it seems to be an integrated patch of land. So can you tell us how this came to be? How were the white soldiers and the African American soldiers all buried here as equals?
Sure. Fairview is a good example of Westfield's evolving attitude toward race. So at a time when many cemeteries were segregated, you have expressed exactly that this is an integrated cemetery, and we have here African American Civil War soldiers and their white peers buried honorably and with great dignity and together. And this is probably the work of the Grand Army of the Republic, which is an organization that formed after the Civil War to support veterans, their pensions, honorable burials. And so you have here an example of the work of the Grand Army of the Republic. Though African American soldiers did not receive pensions, they do have honorable burial here. This is a beautiful spot exemplifying that.
Brightwood Park, located between Prospect Street and Fanwood Ave, has a vibrant history. Kayla Louison tells us more.
I'm here with Rob Lombard in Brightwood Park, where there used to be a bustling African American community. Now the place is peaceful but bare, leaving behind small remnants of nature and the remnants of people who used to live here. I'm Kayla Louison with BDTV, and today we continue to celebrate Black History Month on the Westfield African American History Walking Tour. Can you tell us a little bit about Brightwood Park and the community that used to exist here?
Sure. So Brightwood Park opened as a town park in 1980, but long before it became a municipal park, it was a neighborhood. The first residential development of this area occurred around 1903, when the entire tract was subdivided into small building lots, 25 by 100-foot lots, and streets were laid out on paper at least. There was Liberty Street on the other side of the pond. On this side of the pond was Netherwood Avenue, and next to it was Smith Street, and just behind you is Fanwood Avenue. And part of Fanwood Avenue still exists today, and part of Liberty Street still exists today in neighboring Scotch Plains. But people came, bought property. There was a lot of speculative development, meaning people buying property to sell it and make a profit from it. But over time, by 1920, there were 27 homes here and a church that was established, and it was almost all occupants from the South, all African American individuals who had moved north, sometimes to New York, sometimes to Newark, to Jersey City, and then over time they moved out and settled here. What was unique about this area, as opposed to other areas that were also subdivided and developed, is that it never had any paved roads in the streets. The streets were basically dirt paths, and there was no water or sewer service for the residents. People had wells and had outhouses for their sanitation. And over time, by the 1940s, when all the area around this was all subdivided and many homes were being built, they had paved roads, they had water and sewer services, and this neighborhood never received that benefit of that improvement. Sadly, to me, one of the most glaring things is that the water company built transmission mains through some of these streets, going right by the homes of where people lived, but did not provide any hookup or service to any of the residents that were here. So the community fell into a decline, obviously, of people coming here looking to make a better place for themselves, would want all the improvements of, modern plumbing and things like that. And so the neighborhood really kind of reached a pinnacle in the 1920s. This was a community, and I think what also is critically important to understand is what was happening in Scotch Plains, which is just over the hill behind you. That had the Shady Rest Country Club, one of the first African-American country clubs in the country. In 1930, the Colored Community Playground organization was formed, which is basically a recreational area that was, again, targeted for African-American families primarily, because that area of Scotch Plains was also predominantly African-American at that time as well. That club was like the stop, one of the frequent stopping points for Duke Ellington, Cab Calloway, Ella Fitzgerald, Sarah Vaughan, all of the African-American musicians and performers that were in New York were also becoming here. Even W.E.B. Du Bois lectured at the Shady Rest Country Club. So it was really a focal point for black culture in the 1920s and 1930s, for sure.
That's incredible that they came here.
You really had a community that kind of bordered two different towns, but it was really one community, I suspect, at the time. Mm-hmm. It was really a very integrated, complete social community here at the time.
Today we continue our Black History Month series on Westfield's African American History Walking Tour. Kayla Louison continues her interviews with Rob Lombard of the MLK Association about Brightwood Park's former African American residential community.
At the steps of what used to be Samuel Jarvis's house, where he actually did an interview about his property in 1964. Can you tell us a little bit more about Mr. Jarvis and what happened to his property?
Sure. So, like all of the residents that were still on the property in the 1960s, which were 24 families, the town of Westfield made the decision to buy all the property that was privately owned, and Mr. Jarvis's home was one of 20 plus homes that were acquired by the town at that time. Mr. Jarvis actually his mother had bought the house. Her name was Fanny Donaldson. She bought the house in 1921. She had come from the South again, as Samuel had, from Virginia. He was living alone at the time in the 1960s when the town began the acquisition process. And the article that he appeared in the Courier News, he's talking about the fact that he's living on a disability income. He can't afford, to pay rent somewhere else, and he doesn't want to leave his home. And that interview was conducted the day before the town council voted to acquire all the property. Both he and one other resident were granted life tenancy in his home, meaning that even though he was selling his property to the town, he could still stay. And I don't know how long he was able to stay here, but he sold the house in 1968 and he died in 1976.
So we're here at the steps of the church. Can you tell us a little bit about what happened to a lot of these properties after the town bought them?
So when the town bought the The homes and the church that were here, some of them were intentionally set on fire by the fire department as an area to practice their firefighting skills. Others were burned through vandalism just because the area was so remote that it would be easy for that to happen. And the fact that there was no water here to put fires out was an issue that actually caused the town to put one fire hydrant into the last resident, Cordelia Bell Spencer's home, just so that it would be there if there were a need for her, since she was remaining here. But this church was raised by the town, and what's left in the park are basically the stone remnants, the stone foundations, the stone steps, such as this one for the church.
Kayla Louison's journey throughout the town has sure been interesting.
It has, and today, she joins us in the studio to conclude Black History Month with a special performance by the WHS Chorale. Kayla?
Thanks, Gabe and Dave. As we close out Black History Month, I hope the students of Westfield High School take away not only a newfound knowledge of the mostly untold history of the town, but also now have a better understanding and appreciation of the Black experience. More information about the full African American tour of Westfield can be found at www.mlkwestfield.org. I learned a lot these past few weeks, and I'm glad you were able to learn along with me. Through the perseverance of Black people during times of protest in the civil rights movement and earlier in slavery, songs were sung that reflected the Black experience at the time. These songs passed on in an oral tradition during slavery. They're known as spirituals. They are a significant part of Black history and culture. They were the original outlet for Black people when they could not give their own voices, and with that sense of joint struggle, wove a thick blanket of understanding through the Black community. They were passed on orally through the singing of plantation songs, work songs, and sorrow songs. The song Wade in the Water is a specific tale of the Underground Railroad and how the slaves were able to escape. They told one another to wade in the water to mask their scent from the dogs that hunted them. The WHS Chorale will now perform, giving a compelling end to Black History Month at Westfield High School. Hope you enjoy.
Wade in the water, children, wade in the water. Wade in the water, children, wade in the water. Wade in the water, children, wade in the water. Wade in the water, children, wade in the water. Wade in the water, children, children. Oh, wade in the water, children. In the water, children, water, water. Children, God is gonna trouble the water. Trouble in the water. The water, children. Wade in the water, children, children, wade. Ooh, chills the body and not the soul. River Jordan, chills the body and not the soul. Well, the river Jordan is so chilly. Jordan is so chilly, but not the soul. God's gonna trouble the water. God's gonna trouble the water. God's gonna trouble my children. God's gonna trouble my children. River Jordan, Jordan is chilly. 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 Wade in the water, children, children, wade. Trouble, there's gonna be trouble in the water. Just tell my friends I'm coming too. Trouble, trouble, trouble in the water. Wade in the water, water, children. Wade in the water, my children. Wade in the water. God's gonna trouble the water. God's gonna trouble the water.